city where the Black Five started, and how did it spread from city to city, and in the end encompassed so many different cities throughout the United States. It's like a big territory.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So the man who was credited with introducing basketball to African Americans for the first time on a wide-scale organized basis is a guy named Edwin Henderson. And he was a black school teacher in the segregated public school system in Washington, D.C. And in the summer of 1904, he took a summer class at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he learned basketball, among many other sports. And he learned, when he discovered basketball, he realized, I can take this back and teach this to kids in D.C. because there was a lot of restlessness and energy, and there was a way to give them something to immediately, take their attention. So it took off from there. It became really popular in the D.C. area. Eventually, also though, because the YMCA had missionaries that were going all over the world to spread this information, and people were paying attention to what the YMCA was doing, partly because there was a health crisis in overcrowded cities. A lot of people were getting pneumonia, tuberculosis, and among black people, the mortality rate was 1 in every 4 would die from these diseases, which today, is easily cured. And the solution was, what people thought was, you have to have more lung exercise, you have to have more physical fitness. And so that's how some of the first African-American athletic clubs were founded, because of that reason. And one of them was the Alpha Physical Culture Club, the Monticello Athletic Association, and others. The original reason was for health of the participants. And so in Pittsburgh, in New York, in Brooklyn, Chicago, and elsewhere, at first it was amateur and just for the community, but it slowly spread with the help of the knowledge of the YMCA and experts in physical fitness and in exercise and health. And then also they started to travel around. They contacted each other and said, okay, can you come up? So the Smarts at Athletic Club of Brooklyn contacted the team from Washington, the Washington 12th Streeters, and they said, okay, we'll come up to play you. So then it started a rivalry between Brooklyn and Washington. And then there was already a rivalry between Brooklyn and Harlem. And then suddenly it was, New York versus Chicago, and Chicago versus Pittsburgh. And there were different promoters during that time that would use the black newspapers to create these rivalries, so that they made them, bigger than life in a way, bigger than what they really were. But at the same time, every little game became a headline in the newspapers. So that's how it spread. It became, it was socially popular. If you would get dressed up, and people would go, and it would be, you take your girl on a date, to a basketball game, and because of that success socially, it became a success commercially. And then once it became a success commercially, more and more teams decided, hey, look, we can make money off of this, especially when you got to the Depression. The one thing about my story about, let's say, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, or a place like that was mostly white, you still had to make sure that the fans who were going to that game knew ahead of time that was a black team. Okay. So when the New York Reds came to visit, it said New York Renaissance colored champions.
Wow.
Okay, in parentheses. Because you had to, first of all, nobody would go if it was in the championship team. So first it has to be a championship team.
Right.
But you have to put color. And if you weren't the colored champion, then these promoters started to realize we have to give the team a name that tells people ahead of time that they are black. So that's why Abe Saperstein named his team from Chicago the Harlem Globetrotters, because everyone knew Harlem is black.
Yeah.
Other teams were called the Lion Tamers or the Zulu Kings, because you had to give that exotic flavor, right? So that's how that happened, but it eventually spread. There was even a team in Los Angeles called the Los Angeles Red Devils that Jackie Robinson, who's a famous baseball player, played on that team.
Oh, he played there.
He played on that team, yep, in LA, and it was actually mixed race team eventually. I mean, there were many stars on that team, and they beat some of these, they beat the New York Renaissance, who flew out to LA to play them. They beat other future NBA teams, like the Chicago Gears with George Mikan, by the time you got to this World Championship of professional basketball, which was started in 1939 and ended in 1948, 10-year period, everyone knew that black basketball talent was here to stay. Everyone knew that eventually it was just a matter of time before the NBA would be forced. There were actually two leagues before the NBA that merged to create the NBA. One was the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, and the other one was the NBL, the National Basketball League. And when they merged, it became the NBA. Right. But everybody already knew, even though these two earlier leagues did not allow black players, that eventually something was going to have to shift. Yeah. And there were more and more teams that were mixed. So it just was natural that eventually that was going to happen.
That would be my next question. Like, how did the Black Fives era end? Was it just because the NBA started to come up and it was the natural end of the Black Fives era, or was there, like, I don't know, financial problems or something?
It's some of both. I mean, when the NBA, when those two leagues merged, there was this one opportunity. Both of the leagues were in financial trouble, but they noticed that whenever in order to help their attendance, they would get the Globetrotters to come in and do a double header, which means two games. And so first would be the Globetrotters, and then the NBL or BAA game. Everyone was coming to see the Globetrotters. Then they realized afterwards, well, wait, let's put our game first and then the Globetrotters. That way more people would come, because they were just leaving after the Globetrotters game. Yeah. Same thing with the Wrens. But the Wrens never wanted to do comedy. They always wanted to just be serious basketball. So actually the National Basketball League had one team that failed, and they decided to invite the New York Rens to fill that spot.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, so actually the New York Rens filled the spot in 1948, and they became the Dayton Rens. But they had to take over the losing record of the team. So it was kind of a bad deal, and they eventually didn't make the playoffs, and they lost, even though that was a tremendous team. But at the end of that season, when it came time to decide which NBL teams and which BAA teams would stay in the merger, all the teams except for the Wrens were picked.
Who picked them?
The owners.
Okay.
So what I tell people is that there was an opportunity at the doorstep for Bob Douglas and the Wrens to become a founding team in the NBA, yeah. But it just didn't happen. So after that, after they were locked out or excluded from that merger, that's when the Wrens faded. They folded. They couldn't exist any longer. 1 year later, so 1949, the NBA was formed. 1950, they hired the first 3 black players. One of them was a former Wrens player, Matt Sweetwater Clifton. And after that, there was really nothing that Bob Douglas could do to keep that same kind of interest, because number one, the NBA was now the main league. They did have black players. Also at the time, the black colleges started recruiting black players, and so there was an opportunity to go into that world. And then also the Globetrotters took off. Like right after that, Abe Saperstein, the owner of the Globetrotters, was really against this idea of black players in the NBA because it would ruin his business.
Right.
But he realized, okay, I have to do something different. I'm going to go towards comedy. And right after that, he came to Europe and did the European tour with the players in 1950. Then television came, and all of a sudden, right. That was a big deal. So the Reds were really the last team that were, one of these all-black teams that existed. They were already being eliminated just due to financial reasons, because it was harder and harder to pay the salaries. And then you had Abe Saperstein, you had the college, you had a number of other economic reasons why that was happening. So that team just folded in 1950. He actually sold the name to the Globetrotters, and they used it just as like a warm-up act,
Okay.
and to spread around the his business model. But after that, that was really it. So the NBA, the integration of the NBA, ironically, ended or signaled the end of the Black Fives era, and that's why when we talk about the Black Fives era, it's from 1904, which was the introduction to basketball, to 1950, which was now the whole point of it was Bob Douglas's dream was for there to be equality, or at least equal treatment and fair treatment. So that's what the NBA ended up doing. Yeah.
So overall, do you think, how would you rate the impact or the importance of maybe specific players of the Black Fives era, or the Black Fives era in general, compared to other cultural icons like maybe Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, Malcolm X?
Yes.
Because if nobody knew about history, was there a big impact, or?
There was, yeah, because so you have to go back to how people were feeling and what was going on during that time. So even back from before this, before the 20th century started. So you had the Civil War, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, backlash, and people were being treated really terribly. Black people in America. It was a horrible experience for decades and decades and decades. So anything that was a source of pride, anything that was a source of success, anything that was something, where people in the community could look at that and go and say, okay, this is a good example for us. That was invaluable. Some of these teams were unknown. Some of these contributors were unknown, but they made invaluable contributions because for that period where they lived, or during that time, they made a difference in the community. They helped build the sport. They helped one little step along the way each time. So for example, in boxing, you have Joe Louis, you have Jack Johnson. They were not in a certain way the same as Martin Luther King, but in a certain way they were, because it was the first time that people felt proud of their own accomplishments as a culture, as a race. Just getting a YMCA that was not segregated. Just playing against, beating a white team that was a championship white team, winning the world championship in 1939 was as big as Joe Louis beating Max Schmeling, for example.
Yeah.
So, these are times when people are struggling to just grasp anything that's positive, to keep going. Bob Douglas, he was a pioneer during that time. I think I put him at an equivalent of Martin Luther King or any other civil rights icon, because he took his team to towns where blacks weren't even allowed to stay in hotels, go into restaurants, or even in some cases be walking along the street without being somehow targeted or persecuted. So this was the first time that blacks had been in those locations in some cases, and vice versa. It's the first time that whites in those towns saw the professionalism and the gentlemen. They were always dressed in really nice suits and ties and hats, and the way proper gentlemen would be dressed. And so eventually that led to pioneering and racial breakthroughs in the AAU, in the NCAA, and in other ways, just to even be invited to that tournament. Some of the ones that probably stand out the most are Cumberland Posey from Pittsburgh, of course Bob Douglas. Also there was a man named Will Anthony Madden, who was a tremendous promoter and contributor from period, 1910s. You know, the teams themselves, the Washington Bears were important. They were undefeated in 1943, and they won that national world championship. Of course, the Renaissance. I mean, probably for 25 years they dominated basketball. Not just black teams, but all teams. So there were definitely some of those contributors, individuals that deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. There's a few others. Zach Clayton is one. Puggy Bell. There's some, of course, that I mentioned earlier that are already in. So, you know, these players were also written about in the white papers eventually. Got in Fats Jenkins, and he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He was the captain of that Reds team for about 20 years. So, yeah, there's definitely some, and I think that the importance to the NBA players today is to realize, you know, these guys paid the price, they paved the way for this sport to be as accepted in every corner of the world, really, as it is today.
So, in the NBA nowadays, you have so many black players, and basically the black players are the best players, more or less. As well.
I don't know. What about
but
Dirk?
I mean, yeah, Dirk, of course. But yeah, like the superstars, mostly black. Let's say it that way. But there's no event commemorating, like for example, the Black Fives era, something like that. You have St. Patrick's Day where they wear all like green jerseys. You have like Latina Noche and stuff like that. But there's no event for like the black history of basketball. Why do you think that is, and do you think that is something that the NBA should do?
Yeah, that is definitely what the NBA should do. They should have several nights a year where they honor the teams and celebrate the pioneers of the Black Fives era. And we've proposed to them, and we're talking to them actually, not only to the league at the Adam Silver level, but also to the Players Union, because we've learned that players really want this. They want it because it's not just a racial thing, it just makes sense, even from all angles, whether you're talking about money or whether you're talking about just celebrating the culture, and that it's just the fair thing to do, as you've said. There's also Chinese New Year jerseys, and there's all these different ways. Now the Indiana Pacers are going to do a Hickory, you know, which goes back to Hoosiers. Some of these are not really relevant, and I think that's what you're saying, and I agree with you. Why not have the New York Knicks wear New York Reds?
Right.
What about the Clippers wearing Los Angeles Red Devils?
Yeah.
What about the Sixers wearing Philadelphia Panthers, which is a team from the 1920s, long before the Black Panthers existed?
Yeah.
So we have about 8 or 9 teams that are Black Fives era teams that overlap with NBA teams, and we'd love to work with. Of course, it takes the coordination of Nike, who is going to take over the team rights in 2017. It's going to take coordination from them, the NBA, the Players Union, and also obviously, you know, the players themselves, the teams themselves. We have spoken to the Knicks, the GM, Steve Mills. He's very interested. He said he doesn't want to be the only team that does it.
Right.
Obviously, he also has to get, you know, permission from the owners and from Phil Jackson and to see if they like the idea. We've talked to Adam Silver, who said that would be a great idea. He asked us to speak to teams. I've talked to the Players Union. We just got our first grant as a foundation from the Players Union Foundation. They have a foundation as well. And we just got our first grant, we're proud to say. So we've been able to put 47 brand, you know, swag and gifts into player gift bags at the summer meeting, and also at the rookie transition program, which is really cool because for years, you know, fans of ours have been saying, you know, when are you going to do something with the NBA? They don't realize you don't just do something with the NBA. You don't just say, hey, I'm going to do something with the NBA, right? It takes a lot of navigating and matrix work and different partners, and so, you know, we're slowly getting there. We're still a small organization, but we're getting stronger, bigger, And obviously this really helps. We'd love to continue, just developing this, in other countries, because it helps when you say, black players. I mean, but actually, a lot of the top players now, in terms of fundamentals and basics, are coming from Europe, South America, and other countries. So I've talked to scouts and people in the United States. I mean, I have kids who are in AAU. And AAU in the United States is not always, it depends what team. We're really happy with the team that our son is on, Riverside Hawks in Harlem, who won the national championship last year. But that doesn't mean that every team is great. Some teams they run, they just want to win. But what about learning the pick and roll? What about learning team defense? What about how do you cut off the baseline? Just basics. It's not always just the athleticism. And I think you realize when you look at the players who are exceptional, it's always because they are better at court vision, attitude, leadership, but also the fundamentals, the basic skills. Of course, you have to shoot, run, jump, ball handle, pass, but knowing what to do with those skills is something that we have a lot to learn from Europeans, and certainly. But yeah, I think that would be, and I think that Dirk Nowitzki or any other white player or Spanish player or South American player would be proud to wear a Black Fives jersey in a game, just like African Americans. There's no problem wearing Latina Noche or Chinese New Year. It's just we're all in this together.
Right.